Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to, first of all, respond,
for Caroni Central, and it's after lunch. I'm reminding everybody of Standing Order 53. Those who want to make interruptions can rely on the relevant standing order. Member for Caroni Central.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll engage some of the issues that the member raised in a congenial way, really. As I stand to make a few points, I don't think I will take my full time on this act to combat corruption and other wrongdoings by encouraging and facilitating disclosures of improper conduct in the public and private sector, to protect persons making these disclosures from detrimental action, to regulate the receiving, investigating, or otherwise dealing with disclosures of improper conduct, and to provide for the other matters connected with. The member raised Bhoe Tewarie and the issue of citizens' engagement, Madam Speaker. And I think perhaps the biggest issue of citizens disengagement with the governance process is the dissonance that the citizen feels between what politicians and those in leadership positions say and what they do. And I think we should reflect on that for a moment. It is very real, that dissonance between talk and walk. The member said that it is possible to change a culture, and I do believe with him. I believe what he said to be true. It is possible to change a culture. And I do agree with him also that you can have laws or rules that help to change a culture, just like you can have the introduction of technology that helps to transform or change a culture. I do believe that that is true. But in order to do that, the dissonance between talk and walk must also be arrested. It helps. So the laws support at one level, the technology supports at another level, and the example becomes critical in this process. He said something else that I thought was important. He talked about the culture of corruption and the rising tide of criminality, and that they were connected. I also believe that that is true. Because there is a direct connection, and sometimes many indirect connections between white-collar crime and the crime on the ground. He mentioned I'm not sure if he said the sweep of legislation. I thought you said that. Huh? Suite. The suite of legislation. And I did have this. I've been looking at this for like 3 or 4 months now, the legislation that was promised, the legislation we brought to Parliament. And there are 2 things that I find about the legislation to be extremely strong. It is not limited to this because there might be aberrations. But in general, I find, one, a lot of the legislation is prompted by international demands that require legislative action at home. And the second thing is that a lot of the legislation increases governmental power in the country. And I think if you look at those 2 elements, I mean, you really question the whole motivation behind the local governance process. Not that responding to international promptings is not necessary. I am not so sure that the increasing power of government is justified. But I want to record that when you look at the suite of legislations or maybe this word sweep is a good word. In fact, you find these dominant traits in the legislation. Now, when the Honorable Prime Minister spoke, and he spoke well, he's a good speaker, both on the platform and in the Parliament. And he is always a clear speaker in his methodology and his message, you know. But he talked about an act of urgency, the legislation not being an act of urgency to deal with any specific matter. And he said it was a campaign commitment to bring the whistleblower legislation. And it took them 4 years, but they brought it. He said that they had put it forward before in 2016. It had gone through the Joint Select Committee process. I do agree with my colleague from Oropouche East that the Attorney General, as chair, should have proceeded to complete that process and let it come here with the reports. But having said that, you know, there are many, many other promises that they might have brought also, not just to the Parliament, but to the country. There was one point that he made, though, and I think the Attorney General made a similar point in his presentation, which is that because the private sector is so connected to public money, because of the largeness of government and the extent to which they are connected or dependent on public expenditure, government expenditure, that it was necessary to bring one piece of legislation that legislated for both the public and the private sector. And this is where I begin to have a problem. While I take the issue of public money, while I take the issue of the connection between public and private sector in its exposure and engagement of public money, if that becomes a rationale for basically strengthening the power of government over not just the process involving the public sector, but the process involving the private sector, it can turn out to be a problematic issue in a society such as this that is so connected. The Honorable Prime Minister also said that we must not be afraid to do our duty and that we have nothing to fear. And I want to say, Madam Speaker, we have always, as an opposition, done our duty in this Parliament. Sometimes the government likes it, sometimes they do not like it, but always we do what we feel is right for the legislation and for the moment. The moment being not just a political moment, but the connection of the legislation to things that are happening in the society. So we do not do anything out of fear here. When we don't like something, we ask for it to go to the Joint Select Committee. When it comes here, if we have to make amendments, we do it, as we did with the Wealth Bill. And we play the role of the opposition, which is to critically support. If we like something, we support it. If we don't like something, we don't support it, and we say we don't like it, why we don't like it. And when we have a situation where a compromise is possible, we also signal that. But the Prime Minister talked about corruption in the society generally. He didn't use the word plenty, but he did talk about...
To make an interruption?
Yes, I was asking my friend Central if he would give way, Madam Speaker.
All right.
No, I do not wish to give way, Madam Speaker.
Continue.
I just wanted to make it like this.
And that percentage, continue Caroni Central.
Yes, he said that there was corruption in the society, and we agree. There is corruption in Trinidad and Tobago, as there is in almost every society. But we do not agree with the position of the members for St. Joseph that this is a corrupt society from top to bottom. We do not believe that everybody in this society is corrupt.
Correct.
We believe that there is corruption. We believe that there are corrupt people. We believe that corrupt acts take place. We believe that some people yield to temptation more than others. But we also believe that there are honest people in this country, plenty of them, that they want good government and good governance. And we feel that at the end, people in Trinidad and Tobago, I mean, by and large, they want to have a good government that governs well, and by that they mean fairly. They want a system that allows due respect for the citizen so that they can go about the building of their lives and the management of a life which prepares them for their children's next generation benefits. And they also want to have a place, which is where this whistleblowing legislation comes into play, where if something is going wrong and the institutions are not working, they are not functioning, they want to have an opportunity, or they want to know that they have a safe place where they can get something done, so that something will be done about it. And part of the frustration of the population is that they see things happening all around, and they are not seeing any responses, they are not seeing any consequences, and therefore they get upset. But in doing a piece of legislation such as this, we have to ask ourselves some questions. And these were raised by some of the speakers before, both on our side and on the government side. And that issue is, what kind of societal culture do you need, Madam Speaker, to support whistleblowing legislation as a contribution to public good? Because we have to understand that that is the intention of this piece of legislation, although it doesn't say so. The idea is to create the conditions in which an individual citizen feeling moved to do so can make a contribution to the public good. And at the end of the day, the purpose of it is good governance. And some people talked about the breakdown of ethics in the private sector. I think it was my colleague from Tabaki who talked about that. And we all know that one of the issues in governance and in government everywhere, including Trinidad and Tobago, but also elsewhere, is the business of corruption in the public apparatus of the state. So the issue is what is the culture that you need for that? And it is becoming even more fierce because we know from 2008 there has been a kind of collapse of the ethical foundations of the whole capitalist order. That is one thing. And we certainly know that what is happening everywhere is that constitutions are being tested, whether it's by our neighbor in Venezuela or whether it is in the epitome of so-called democracies in this hemisphere, which is the United States of America. So there is constitutional testing at the political level, and we have had the collapse of the ethical foundations within the private sector made very, very clear in 2008, 2009. So it's a problem. So we are trying to build this legislation and to present this legislation now in this kind of climate where we are also affected, because we were affected, Madam Speaker, by the 2008-2009 crisis here in the matter of the big insurance company called Clico and others that were affected during that period. But we are also affected by issues. So for instance, in our time when we were in government, we did the procurement legislation. It took us a little while to get it to the parliament, but we passed that legislation, and it was precisely, people need to remember that there might have been 10 or 12 years that had passed with that legislation trying to make it to birth. And it was the People's Partnership that nursed that process in order to create the conditions for the passage of that legislation. So you need a certain culture in order to do it. What type of institutional system is necessary? Now, we know that there are realities if you go to work in a certain place. For instance, if you be in a cabinet of a country, there is such a thing as confidentiality of cabinet and collective responsibility. If you are in the public service, you know that there are certain things which require you to be confidential about as part of the public service operations. If you work in a private sector institution, depending on the level that you are, you might be asked to even sign something which says confidentiality, secrecy, etc. And therefore, if you have this element present in your society, whether in the public or private sector, and you have legislation like this, you immediately have a conflict of intention and a conflict of interest, and you put an employee or a potential whistleblower in a position where at some point in time they have to choose. And the protection offered by the legislation, I want to say, my problem with the legislation is that I am not sure that it offers enough protection to the whistleblower. And at the same time, it has the propensity to create the conditions for a massive news-making society, a news-carrying society. It is that extremity which you need to contain, which I think is absent or missing in the bill, and I think not thoughtfully rendered, all right, in the, what you call it, the composition of the bill, Madam Speaker. Now, what objective is support for whistleblowing meant to serve? I mentioned the issue of the public good, and this is important. And one of the questions that arises is public good superior to individual rights and individual freedoms? That's a hard question. That is a real hard question. One has to do with the heart of constitutional and human rights questions in most societies, and the other one has to do with a philosophical view of how you build a civilization. These things have been written about for centuries, Madam Speaker. And that's a very hard question. I want to say something. The Japanese have a whistleblower legislation that they passed in 2004. And you know how they describe the objective of that legislation? I read just a little part of it. The purpose of this legislation is to contribute to the stabilization and general welfare of the life of every citizen. It is the same thing, you know, to do with whistleblowing. And it is strong in this legislation about people having the right to do the right thing when something is wrong. But their conception of what this thing is meant to be is far, in my view, Madam Speaker, and I'm sure in yours, significantly superior in vision, in sensibility, in a sense of ethos about the society itself. And I think that those are the elements of the bill, I think, that trouble me. Another issue that it raises, therefore, in that context, is what level and dimension of citizenship does it require for responsible practice of whistleblowing? Because I said two of the issues was it doesn't protect the whistleblower well enough, but the second issue is that it can create the condition in which everybody is news carrying about everybody. And you can have a problem. What is the level of citizenship responsibility that you need, and how do you cultivate that? How do you help that? And I want to start with the original issue that I raised, drawing on what my friend from Maruga Tableland said, which is that dissonance between what you say and what you do, the leadership by example question, being critical in this regard, because citizenship behavior is a response to either the evolving nature of leadership by example at the top or the deteriorating nature of leadership by example at the top. That is what characterizes citizenship behavior. So, one of the early points I made was that I had a problem with state jurisdiction over private sector industries. And I do have a problem with that, Madam Speaker. Because you see, the state is large and the state owns a significant proportion of the industries in this country. Perhaps getting a little smaller now, I don't know, because as industries are divested, you are also creating more state enterprises. So it may well be growing. But if you bring whistleblowing having to do with private sector institutions under the control of the 21 government agencies identified here, Madam Speaker, I think you are drawing the private sector into a domain. I don't know if they would wish to go there. And secondly, I don't know what the implications are for government exercise of control over those private institutions. Because you see, many of the institutions we create are meant to be independent in name, Madam Speaker, and to be also independent in reality. But the temptation is such, because of the political process and constitutional power in our country, that many of those institutions which are meant to be independent can be politicized by the process of appointments and by other things. That then creates a situation in your society where bringing the private sector under this ambit now can create a double jeopardy problem. And I want to warn against it. I don't think it's healthy for our society. I am against this kind of state expansion of control in any society. But in a little country like Trinidad and Tobago, 1.4 million, maybe more now with the migration and so on, and will increase. But it's still a small society. As bad as things might be, or seem to us sometimes, we still manage to govern pretty well. There is still a fear. There is, yes, a lot of interdependence, but there is a fear, sectoral sense of independence between government on the one hand, private sector on the other. And we've had a creeping situation here, Madam Speaker, which we need to acknowledge. We had legislation that we passed here that brought the entire NGO sector under state control. A governance system which allows for effective individual scrutiny of every civil society institution in the society. I am not against the scrutiny. I am against a situation in which government, being a principal funder of many of these civil society institutions, now have really executive power over many of these institutions on the basis of demand for certain accountability. So that's that. So you bring your NGO. How is a society organized by and large? You have your mass of citizens, but you have government. You have the private sector involved in various business at different levels. You have your civil society sector. And you have the public sector serving under the governance arrangement of the government in power. Now, when you bring more and more institutions, more and more sectors of society under governmental scrutiny of this type, you're really creating a society that you do not want, Madam Speaker. I mean, today, you might be the government, today somebody else might be the government. But one day, some crazy person might be in government. And, Madam Speaker, it has happened in countries that never expected that that would happen to them. And if that's why you have to make laws which recognize certain restraints, which recognize the limits of reach, which recognize the curbs that you need to have inherently on power within the society of those least able to manage it. And therefore, I want to say, Madam Speaker, that this is a matter that I'm concerned about. I really do not feel, you know, if BP wants to organize its own entity to manage whistleblowing, fine, I have no problem with that. If a state enterprise wants to have its own entity to manage whistleblowing, I have no problem with that. If Ansa Makal wants to have its own whistleblowing authority, but to have all the private sector institutions also contained in a situation where these individual institutions, a person can write to these institutions and bring them under government scrutiny by whatever process. You may argue that it's independent institutions or they're arm's length or whatever. Now, there are some that are justified, like the SEC issue. There are yet others that you can justify. But my own feeling is that you have to be very cautious about what you justify and how much you bring into it. I have a document here which I just want to share a few lines from, which is, it's taken from an article. I don't have the whole article. I pull out what I needed. Combating Corruption, the Development of Whistleblowing Laws in the United States, Europe, and Armenia, by David Schultz and Kachik Harutyunyan. It's a difficult name, and it was published in 2015. It says here that the first issue is that whistleblowing must have a strong moral, constitutional foundation in a given society. Okay? It asks for that. I asked the question, what are the conditions which allow you to do that? The second thing is that first, whistleblowers should act based only out of respect and honor of fellow citizens and not because of selfish motives, such as revenge or the elimination of a candidate for career growth. And second, the media and authorities must act together to portray good whistleblowers as heroes. We have a history in this country, my colleague here talked about it, in which a whistleblower came to a very bad end. And we have instances of recent whistleblowers who have been demonized in the public space. And the culture is not here. Look at the combative culture sometimes in the parliament, Madam Speaker. With all due respect for you, it's not you. It's the fact of partisan political behavior in the parliament. And many times you know that I have raised this issue, that if you have a very confrontational stand in the parliament, it makes it very difficult to find consensus on certain things. We go on here. They talk about legislative and institutional measures. I raised the issue of institution. The leadership of this new body, that's to say, if you are creating an institution to deal with this business of whistleblowing, the leadership of this new body should be appointed/elected by the legislature. You know why? Because they want multi-partisan scrutiny. Must be appointed, elected by the legislature, and through a super transparent, inclusive, and cross-society participation procedure in order to gain public trust. And the leadership of the body should enjoy immunity for the whole period of service, and removal from office should be
Member
possible.
for Caroni Central, the original time is now expired. You're entitled to 15 more minutes to complete your presentation.
I'll be grateful.
You may proceed.
Ma'am, in all truth, I did not even think I would speak for half an hour. But I will make a few points and complete. The leadership of this body should enjoy immunity for the whole period of service, and removal from office should be possible only by a parliamentary decision. You know why? Because you want to protect the people who have the responsibility of protecting whistleblowers. Think of their authority. They have to protect these whistleblowers. So the best way how to deal with a whistleblower, all right, if you have a problem with a whistleblower and you have criminal intent and criminal capacity for power, is to get to one of the people in charge of that, as they have done in other countries in which they have gotten to judges in the system. I mean, we're dealing with the real world here, Madam Speaker. So, I think that is something that if we take this seriously, and I think I had something here on Nigeria too, you know. Now, Nigeria, as you know, is a country in which corruption does exist, just like here. But they tried to do certain things. They talk about the structure. A structure built on technology is the best bet for a safer system of protection. For instance, the policy should provide for protective measures to be employed in data transfer, should consider the possibility of and present interception and hacking of the ministry's computer system, should consider anonymization of data, and the desirable of a third-party repository for data. Okay, so they're talking about the protection process. Now, take our bill. What does this bill here have? The minister is the person to whom the entities report. And if I'm correct, in this bill is the Minister of National Security.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, given the wisdom of other people who have executed this in practice, and the derivatives they are now taking from seeing it work, this is not by interested parties. These are by academics who are looking at the system to see whether it's working, and how it works best. Shouldn't we take a little caution and get this out of political hands and not have the private sector with government and ministers in charge? And it's a society we're building. It's a civilization we want to build. You know, so, Madam Speaker, I've raised some of the issues I want to raise, and I have only one more that I want to raise. This bill does not deal with the question of journalism. And I want to know what is the position of a journalist to whom a whistleblower comes and gives information, and that journalist then publishes the article in the public domain. Because I want a clear answer to that question. So the question I am asking is whether a journalist in such a situation is protected, whether the whistleblower is protected. Now, I know that there are laws and rules that protect sources in journalism. Had that not been possible, Nixon would have seen his full term. But it is an issue that remains there. You see, because one of the countries on which we claim we modeled this legislation was Malta. And I don't know, Madam Speaker, if members on the other side are aware of a name called Daphne Caruana Galicia. And that woman, who was a journalist, fairly young, who wrote about government corruption, nepotism, patronage, allegations of money laundering. One day she came home in the evening she came from work in the evening to go to her apartment. And what happened was that her entire car blew up with her in it, and she was gone. Up to now, I think they jailed 3 people. I think they have 3 people for trial. I don't know what is going to happen in that particular instance. But I think since we are using models from countries in which that could happen, and she was a prolific journalist who did it on many occasions, I think this is something that we should worry about and be concerned about. And one of the countries that we modeled it on, they say, is Malaysia. Malaysia is a country, you know, Anwar Ibrahim used to be Minister of Finance. He came here in Trinidad. I was minister at the time in the NAR government. And he came here and he had very high hopes for aspirations of his country and so on. He fell out with the Prime Minister Mahathir. He became leader of the opposition. They jailed him. God knows what they did with him in jail. And then he eventually came out, and because of problems in the society, including corruption by the government, which won the elections and eliminated all of them from government, the former Prime Minister and him got together. He is now back in government again. But that is a country in which one of the charges that he was making was the issue of corruption. And he ended up in jail for being an accuser of government corruption. So I'm saying that when we make the legislation and we draw the models, we must also understand the history and the context, Madam Speaker. Because not everything that glitters is gold. And we have to be careful about what we are doing. And as I say, this legislation covers broad terrain which neither protects the whistleblower fully and can create the conditions in which you have a nation of tattlers, basically, you know, screaming corruption of other people. And Lord knows, depending on the direction of any particular government at the time and the ethos of that time, how that can emerge in your society. And there's one final thing that I want to say, and this is important, which is that the member for St. Augustine raised the issue of the problem of witness protection. I don't want to belabor the point, but it's a reality. People have been executed for being a witness before they go to trial, before they go to testify in a trial. So that is an issue of concern. And this thing does not guarantee any such protection. You know that. This guarantees really protection from litigation, protection from being fired, protection from, you know, demotion, you know, things like that. But there's a more sinister element depending on the level of corruption. And we talk every day, all the legislation that has been brought here, what it is: terrorism, crime, money laundering, drugs. The Prime Minister this morning raised the issue of gambling, big money, he said, and big malfeasance, which is recorded nowhere in the public documents for 2016, 17, or 18, he read from the documents. All of these things. Imagine you are a whistleblower in this situation in which so much money is involved. Who in the government or in this nation, Madam Speaker, is going to protect you from physical harm in this country? I mean, we have to give some thought to this thing. Legislation is not a joke to just come here and say, listen, opposition, join hands with us and pass. This is a serious, serious matter. You have to put institutions in place, structures in place. You have to have systems in place. You have to get your institutions all right. Madam Speaker, I do not want to go where you prevented one of my colleagues from coming, but there are three principal institutions that affect us here. And one of them now, at the highest level, is in a situation of uncertainty. Okay? I mean, the executive of this country at any given point in time is always under pressure. You know that, besides that one. And then parliamentarians, we talk already about the issue of governance and the alienation of people from the governance process. And we know that many of the institutions do not work. Look at the testimony of one of the prosecutors before a joint select committee the other day, talking about how she, as a prosecutor out of the DPP's office, what she has to face every day. If she has to do that, what is the position of magistrates? What is the position of judges? What is the position of other officers executing the law making and the law execution process? It is a problematic issue, Madam Speaker. And my own feeling is that this bill is really quite deficient to the time, the context, the stage at which we are in the society, and does not take into account the really problematic area of the intertwining of money laundering, gambling, crime, the drugs, all of these things. And I think that this takes a view of a society that you can timidly rein in and get to change its behavior when the attendant conditions all around us tell us that, look, we are dealing with a fierce reality that needs something much more substantial than this in order to stand the test of time. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute.